She adopted 5 black boys who had been rejected by everyone else. 25 years later, they did something that got the whole country talking. Watch until the end. You won't believe how it ends. Subscribe and write which city you're from. Mary Ann Hale lived in the kind of quiet that clung to old houses. It settled into the corners of rooms, sat on the windowsills like dust, and echoed faintly in every creak of the wooden floorboards. Her home, a modest 2-story clapboard house that once belonged to her mother, stood on a narrow street in the southern part of a town that had long since stopped growing. Most of the houses nearby had fresh coats of paint, new fences, trimmed lawns. Hers stood slightly apart, not in disrepair, but aged, paint faded to a soft gray blue, roses along the porch unruly but fragrant. A mailbox that leaned slightly as if tired of holding the same advertisements year after year. Mary Ann was 42, though the years had worn her more than she admitted. Her blonde hair, usually twisted into a practical bun, had begun to silver at the temples. She had the gentle demeanor of someone who had spent a lifetime listening more than speaking, and eyes the color of worn denim, soft, thoughtful, perpetually scanning the world for something she couldn't quite name. She worked at the town library, where she cataloged books, read stories to children on Saturdays, and offered recommendations to anyone who asked, though few did. Her days followed a rhythm as dependable as the grandfather clock in her living room. Morning tea at 6, bus to the library at 7:30, home by 5, dinner by 6, and then hours spent in the company of books or gardening until sleep took her. The routine wasn't fulfilling, but it was safe, predictable. And after the last several years of her life, safe was a kind of victory. There had been a time, not so long ago, when Mary Ann believed her life would follow a different path. She had married at 31, later than most women in her town, but full of hope. Her husband, Evan, had been a quiet man too, a school teacher with a fondness for classical music and crossword puzzles. For a while, they had been content. They bought a home together, this home, and dreamed of children, of Sunday breakfast and crayon drawings on the fridge. But those dreams began to wither with each passing year of trying and failing to conceive. Doctors offered words like unexplained infertility, low probability, and IVF. Treatments followed, expensive, exhausting, inconclusive. The silences between them grew longer, the laughter less frequent. One morning, Mary Ann woke up alone. There was a note on the kitchen table written in Evan's even script. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." That was all. No confrontation, no last goodbye, just the sound of the screen door closing behind him and a house that became suddenly too large for one. That was 5 years ago. Since then, Mary Ann had adjusted to her solitude the way one adjusts to chronic pain. Not with acceptance exactly, but with resignation. She told herself she was lucky. She had a job, a roof over her head, and a garden full of her mother's roses. She no longer hoped for children. That dream she had buried alongside the old baby clothes she had once bought in secret and kept in a cedar chest in the attic. Still, every now and then, she would catch herself watching mothers with children at the grocery store or library, and something inside her would ache. It was on one such day, a gray Tuesday in early spring, that Mary Ann received a call from the local child welfare center. The director, a woman named Carol, whom Mary Ann had met once during a library fundraiser, asked if she might be willing to read to some children as part of a community outreach program. Mary Ann agreed without hesitation. It was a small thing, an hour out of her day, and besides, She had always felt most alive when surrounded by the quiet curiosity of children. She arrived at the center that Friday afternoon, her tote bag full of picture books, her heart oddly nervous. The building itself was functional and clean, but carried a weight to it, the kind that comes from holding too many stories of loss. The walls were decorated with finger-painted suns and lopsided hearts. A receptionist led her to a room where several children sat on beanbags, some fidgeting, others staring into nothing. A staff member whispered that most of the kids were in temporary placement, awaiting foster homes. Then she saw them. 5 boys all sitting together near the back, close enough to touch but not interacting. The oldest looked about 10, tall and thin with watchful eyes. Beside him sat a boy of 8, shorter, quiet, his gaze fixed on his hands. 2 identical twins, around 6, leaned against each other like mirror images, fidgeting, whispering, hiding nervous smiles. The youngest, maybe 3, sat with his thumb in his mouth and his other hand clutching a worn stuffed dog. "They're all brothers," the staff member murmured beside her. "Parents died in a car fire last fall. No family stepped up. They're considered a hard placement since they want to stay together." The words echoed in her ears. Hard placement, like a shipment of broken goods. Mary Ann sat down and began to read, her voice steady, the story cheerful. Some of the children responded with giggles or questions, but the 5 boys stayed mostly silent. Still, they watched her, especially the oldest. There was something in his gaze. Suspicion, yes, but also a flicker of curiosity. After the session, as the children were led away, Mary Ann stood frozen by the door. She couldn't stop thinking about them. That night, she dreamed of a small boy with sad eyes holding onto her sleeve, asking, "Are you my mama now?" She dismissed it as emotion, a reaction to a sad story and too much tea. But the next day she went back, and the day after that. Soon, she was volunteering at the center weekly. She began to learn their names: Malik, Jaden, Rico, Ramsey, and Elias. She learned their patterns, how Malik always stood between the others and new people, how Jaden never spoke unless asked directly, how Rico and Ramsey could make each other laugh but rarely anyone else, how Elias would only nap if someone sang to him first. They were beautiful boys, smart, protective of one another, scarred, though they never said so. One afternoon, after reading a book about a magical treehouse, Mary Ann caught Malik watching her with a strange intensity. "You don't have to keep coming," he said. His voice was quiet, guarded. "I know," she replied. "Most people stop." "I won't." He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. That night, Mary Ann sat at her kitchen table, staring at the same place Evan's note had once rested. The house felt colder than usual. She made herself a cup of tea and sat in silence, then rose and walked to the attic. The cedar chest hadn't been opened in years. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside were soft yellow blankets, a rattle shaped like a lion, a set of tiny blue booties. She sat on the floor and wept. By morning, her decision was made. She called the center and asked what it would take to adopt all 5 boys. The voice on the other end of the line hesitated, then asked if she was serious. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." The road ahead would be difficult. She knew that. The paperwork, the system, the questions, the judgment, it would come. But so would the chance to give those boys a home, a mother, a life where they were wanted, not despite being together, not despite their past, but because they were who they were. Mary Ann Hale had once believed her life was over, that she had missed her chance at motherhood, at love, at meaning. But in that moment, As she stood in the middle of her quiet house, she felt the faint stirrings of something long thought dead: hope. And with it, a determination as fierce and unshakable as any she had ever known. She would not let those boys go. Not again. Not ever. The days that followed Mary Ann's decision passed in a flurry of appointments, calls, and sleepless nights. What had once been a vague ache in her heart had transformed into a fire that lit her from within. The image of the 5 boys never left her. She saw them everywhere, etched into the patterns of raindrops on her kitchen window, dancing in the laughter of passing children outside the library, lingering in the silence of her home. Malek's guarded stare, Jaden's hunched shoulders, Rico and Ramsey's nervous giggles, and little Elias' thumb perpetually in his mouth. Each face anchored itself to her soul. She walked into the child welfare office with resolve stitched into every step. The building, beige and severe, smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. A woman with a pinched mouth and tired eyes met her at the front desk and asked her to fill out a preliminary interest form. The words "interested in adopting" were printed neatly across the top, and Mary Ann wrote her name with a steady hand. When the woman scanned the paper and noted the section that listed number of children to adopt, her eyes widened. "All 5?" she asked, glancing up. "You mean siblings?" Mary Ann nodded. "Yes, all 5. The brothers I've been reading to every week." The woman pursed her lips. "That's highly unusual, Miss Hale. Most people won't even consider 3, let alone 5, especially alone." "I know," Mary Ann said, keeping her voice calm, "but I'm not most people. And they deserve to stay together." She was directed to a caseworker named Darlene, a tall, broad-shouldered woman with an afro haloing her head and glasses perched low on her nose. Her office was cluttered but warm, filled with plants and photos of smiling children. She motioned for Mary Ann to sit. "You're serious about this?" Darlene asked after hearing her out, her voice laced with surprise but not disbelief. "I'm very serious." "You live alone?" "Yes." "Any prior experience raising children?" "No, but I've worked with them for years. I've taught, mentored, volunteered, and I know that love and stability matter more than perfection." Darlene leaned back and studied her. "You realize the boys have trauma, right? Especially Malek and Jaden. Elias is still barely verbal. The twins, well, they bounce off each other, but they've been through things too. It's not just about keeping them fed and clothed. You'd need to be ready for behavior issues, identity questions, medical appointments, possibly therapy." Mary Ann nodded. "I'm ready for all of it, or at least I'm willing to try, and I'll get help where I need it." The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. They discussed finances, housing, family support systems, cultural readiness, and legal processes. By the end, Darlene tapped her pen against the desk thoughtfully. "You're going to have an uphill battle, Mary Ann. You're white. They're black. That alone will raise eyebrows, inside the system and out. I don't want to erase who they are. I just want to love them." "That's a good start," Darlene said, "but it won't be enough for everyone." Mary Ann left the office with a list of prerequisites that felt like an entire life's worth of paperwork: background checks, home inspections, parenting classes, financial disclosures, letters of recommendation. She spent the following weeks immersed in the process, barely sleeping, surviving on instant coffee and the occasional peanut butter sandwich. Every free hour outside the library was spent filling forms, attending state-mandated training sessions, researching transracial adoption and culturally responsive parenting. There were moments of doubt, private, clawing moments late at night when the enormity of it all crashed down on her. When she stared at her savings account and wondered how she'd afford 5 pairs of shoes for school, 5 winter coats, 5 backpacks. When she remembered the look her supervisor gave her at work upon learning of her plan, a tight smile followed by a cautious, "Are you sure this is the right time for such a big change?" Then came the day the first agency rejected her application. The letter arrived on a Friday, folded crisply, its language sterile and cold. "While we appreciate your enthusiasm, we believe this particular case requires a dual-parent household or a caregiver with extensive trauma-related care experience." Mary Ann read it 3 times before setting it on the table and walking into the backyard. The roses were blooming late that year, a burst of color against the gray of her fence. She sat down on the porch steps and breathed in their scent, grounding herself in the simple truth that love was not measured by resumes. She didn't give up. Instead, she contacted another agency, and then another. She began a journal documenting everything: conversations, thoughts, frustrations. Darlene stayed in her corner, advocating for her internally, reminding her that perseverance was as essential in motherhood as in bureaucracy. "The system's not built for this kind of love," she said once on the phone, "but that's why it matters more when it happens." Mary Ann also found support in unexpected places. An elderly black neighbor, Miss Geraldine, whose grandchildren visited on weekends, offered wisdom and cultural insight over cups of sweet tea on the front porch. A local black pastor, hearing her story through Darlene, invited her to attend community events and meet families who had experience with adoption and cross-racial parenting. At first, Mary Ann felt out of place, aware of her whiteness, her ignorance, but she came back again and again, asking questions, listening, learning. The scrutiny increased. Social workers visited her home, opening cupboards, checking smoke detectors, measuring bedrooms. One asked pointedly whether she thought 5 boys of color might be too much for a woman who lived alone. Mary Ann didn't flinch. "They're not a burden. They're a family." When news spread in town, reactions were mixed. A woman at the grocery store whispered loudly to her husband, "Why would she do that to herself?" A fellow librarian asked her with concern if she was experiencing a midlife crisis. An older man from the neighborhood crossed the street rather than share the sidewalk with her and her future children. But for every narrowed gaze there was a nod, a quiet thank you, a smile. And most importantly, there were the boys, waiting. After nearly 7 months, on a humid morning in early August, Mary Ann received the call she had dared not hope for. "The judge signed the order," Darlene said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're officially approved. They're yours, Mary Ann, all 5 of them." She sat in stunned silence, the words echoing through her like a bell. Yours. The boys were hers. The next few days unfolded in a blur. She cleaned the rooms that had been sitting unused for years, painted the walls in bright colors, purchased second-hand bunk beds, and found a crib for Elias. The community helped in small, beautiful ways. A teacher donated school supplies. A neighbor dropped off books. Miss Geraldine brought over a casserole and 2 boxes of children's clothes from her church. The house began to fill with not just furniture, but with breath, with purpose, with anticipation. When the boys finally arrived, each holding a small bag of belongings and expressions that ranged from suspicion to exhaustion, Mary Ann stood on the porch and opened her arms. "Welcome home," she said softly. Malik's eyes narrowed, scanning the house, the yard, her face. He didn't say anything. Neither did the others. but Elias reached out unprompted and touched her hand. That night, after hours of organizing beds and unpacking clothes, she sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by the new sounds of life. Running feet upstairs, the clatter of a toy dropping, the whisper of twin voices behind closed doors. Her heart was full and aching, tender and terrified. The boys were asleep. She peeked into each room, checked their blankets, listened to their breathing, watched as Elias clutched his stuffed dog. She returned to her own room and turned off the lamp, lying in the darkness as her mind replayed every doubt, every fear, every voice that had told her she couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't. And then she thought of Malik's eyes, of Elias' tiny hand in hers, of the quiet bond that had begun to form. Against all odds, they were together now, and she would not let them down. The morning after the boys arrived, Mary Ann awoke not to the usual quiet hum of her old house, but to the sound of feet pattering across the upstairs hallway, a door slamming shut, and muffled voices arguing over who got the blue toothbrush. It was a strange symphony, jarring and wonderful all at once. For the first time in years, the silence she had grown used to was broken, and in its place was life. Breakfast was chaos. Malik, ever the protector, sat at the table with his arms crossed, eyeing everything with caution. Jaden silently stirred his cereal but didn't eat. The twins, Rico and Ramsey, argued over who got the last slice of toast. Little Elias clung to his stuffed dog and refused to sit in the booster seat Mary Ann had carefully selected. She had burned the eggs, spilled the orange juice, and forgotten which one didn't like peanut butter, but when she looked around at the 5 boys in her kitchen, something in her heart settled. The first week was a whirlwind of adjustments. The boys were used to temporary spaces, to rules that changed with every adult in charge, to furniture that didn't belong to them. Mary Ann's house, though old, was theirs now. She gave them rooms, not beds in a line, and asked them to help her paint the walls in colors they chose themselves. Rico wanted red. Ramsey wanted green. They compromised with orange and made a mess that took 3 days to clean. Malik wanted blue, deep and dark like the sky before a storm. Jaden didn't choose a color at all, only shrugged when asked. Mary Ann chose a soft gray blue for his walls, the same color as her own bedroom, hoping it would offer comfort. There were other adjustments too, less visible but more pressing. The boys had no sense of schedule. They stayed up late, whispering to each other, sometimes sneaking into the kitchen for snacks at midnight. They were suspicious of her rules, polite to her face, but clearly waiting for the moment she would change, like others had. Jaden, especially, seemed to retreat deeper into silence, always watching, never volunteering his thoughts. Elias cried often and loudly, sometimes over nothing at all, and Mary Ann learned quickly that holding him through his tantrums calmed him faster than scolding him ever could. She made mistakes, many of them. She burned dinners, forgot appointments, mixed up names. Once, in a hurry, she confused Rico and Ramsey in front of their teacher, and they didn't speak to her for hours. Another time, she tried to braid Elias's hair without knowing how, and he wailed until Miss Geraldine came over to fix it properly and gently showed Mary Ann the basics. Humility became her closest ally, and with every misstep came learning. She began to keep a notebook with details: who liked their sandwiches cut diagonally, who couldn't fall asleep without the nightlight, who had nightmares on Tuesdays. School brought its own set of challenges. The local elementary school was not prepared for 5 new students. especially not 5 who came from trauma. Malik was placed in a class where his teacher assumed he was aggressive simply because he was quiet and tall. Jaden was reprimanded for daydreaming, though he had tested 2 grade levels above in reading. Rico and Ramsey were separated despite Marianne's requests, and both started acting out. Elias was too young for school, but had to be evaluated for early development intervention, where a white therapist spoke about him in the third person as though he wasn't in the room. When Marianne brought these concerns to the school principal, she was met with a tight smile and practiced placation. "We understand your concerns, Miss Hale, but sometimes transitions are difficult." "They're not the ones struggling to transition," Marianne said firmly. "Your staff is." She pushed. She advocated. She attended every school meeting, every parent night. She called the district and filed formal complaints when needed. She joined a local parents group, mostly black mothers, and listened. She asked questions others were too proud to ask and accepted correction when she erred. Slowly, the school began to shift. Malik was transferred to a more supportive teacher who saw his quiet confidence. Jaden was enrolled in an advanced reading program. Rico and Ramsey were reunited in the same classroom with a firm but loving instructor who understood their dynamic. Elias's new therapist met him on the floor, eye to eye, and called him by name. At home, Marianne worked just as hard to build trust. She created routines, not strict but reliable. Dinner at 6, homework afterward, one-on-one time before bed. Every Sunday became family day, where they cooked together, sometimes disastrously, and watched movies in a pile of blankets on the living room floor. She introduced chore charts with colorful stickers and small rewards. Malik scoffed at first, but ended up taking pride in his assigned tasks. The twins turned cleaning the playroom into a competition. Jaden, ever quiet, surprised her one day by vacuuming the entire downstairs without being asked. One evening, as Marianne was folding laundry, Jaden walked into the room and handed her a paper. It was a drawing. Her, standing in front of the house, the boys around her, all smiling. Above it, in shaky block letters, he had written, "Our family." Her hands trembled as she took it. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice. Jaden only nodded and walked away, but his face carried the faintest trace of a smile. Moments like that were rare, but they were everything. They came without warning. Rico sneaking into the kitchen just to say goodnight. Malik offering to help Elias tie his shoes. Ramsey crawling into her lap during a thunderstorm. These moments reminded her that love wasn't loud. It was quiet, consistent, patient. It wasn't about grand gestures, but about showing up every single day, even when it was hard, even when it was thankless. There were setbacks, of course. There were fights. Over toys, over bedtime, over who got to sit in the front seat. Elias caught the flu and passed it to all of them in a span of 2 weeks. Rico broke a lamp during a tantrum. Malik once screamed at her in frustration, "You're not our real mom," and slammed the door so hard it cracked. She cried in the bathroom that night, knees pulled to her chest, wondering if she was in over her head. But the next morning, Malik left an apology note under her tea mug. The words messy but sincere. She wasn't perfect, and neither were they. But somehow, amidst the spilled milk, scraped knees, and slammed doors, a family was forming. They began to celebrate victories together. When Rico got a gold star in art class, they had ice cream for dinner. When Elias learned to spell his name, they danced in the kitchen. Marianne posted their drawings on the fridge and framed their certificates on the wall. She taught them how to fold laundry, how to cook pasta, how to say sorry and mean it. She read them stories every night, her voice soft and steady, and let them interrupt with questions. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were growing. Marianne noticed changes in herself, too. She laughed more, even when things were messy. Her hands, once always clean and still, became accustomed to scrubbing grass stains and braiding hair. She became less concerned with the opinions of others and more focused on the well-being of her boys. Her life, once orderly and solitary, had become full of noise and meaning. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch, watching the twins chase each other through the yard, Jaden curled beside her with a book, and Elias napped on her lap. She felt something she hadn't felt in years: belonging. She was no longer the woman with the empty house. She was no longer waiting for life to start. It had started, and it was beautiful in its chaos. By the time 3 years had passed, the Hale household had settled into something resembling rhythm. The chaos hadn't disappeared, it never would entirely, but it had softened, reshaped itself into a familiar hum. There were still nights when someone woke from a nightmare and padded into Marianne's room, eyes wide with fear. There were still days when the boys fought over toys or chores or who got to ride shotgun on the way to school. But beneath it all, there was love, solid and unshakable. Marianne had become their home, and they had become hers. The boys had grown taller, louder, and bolder. Malik was now 13, with a voice that had dropped low and a temper that flared like dry leaves catching fire. He was lean and strong, obsessed with drawing buildings and bridges, often losing himself in sketches for hours. He had a deep need for control, for structure, but also a quiet softness that appeared in rare, unguarded moments, like when Elias climbed onto his back or when Jaden had trouble falling asleep and Malik stayed beside him, wordlessly, until he did. Jaden, now 11, remained the most reserved. He was brilliant, quietly so, and devoured books at a speed Marianne could hardly keep up with. He'd become fascinated with biology and anatomy, asking questions about how hearts worked, how bones healed, how medicine could save people. He was gentle in his speech, precise in his movements, and his silences were no longer fear. They were thought. Rico and Ramsey, at 9, were whirlwinds. Their personalities had diverged as they aged, but they remained deeply bonded. Rico was louder, brasher, with a knack for fashion and flair. He cut up old clothes and stitched them together into dramatic, mismatched outfits, proudly modeling them around the house. Ramsey, more introspective, had taken to sketching outfits for Rico, providing designs for his brother's looks. Together, they turned the garage into a studio and filled it with fabric scraps and old mannequins Marianne had picked up at a yard sale. Elias was now 6, talkative and inquisitive, with a love for music that startled them all. He would hum melodies he made up himself, often sitting under the table or in the bathtub, lost in his own world of rhythm. His favorite game was turning pots and pans into drums. Marianne bought him a small keyboard for Christmas, and he played it until the batteries wore out. His teachers said he had a rare ear for tone and pitch. He also had a tenderness that never faded. He hugged everyone, constantly and without warning. But as the boys flourished, the pressures of adolescence began to press inward. Malik struggled with anger. He felt the weight of being the oldest, the protector, and sometimes that pressure erupted. He began talking back at school, challenging authority, refusing to participate in group activities. Teachers labeled him difficult. At home, he became moodier, more withdrawn. He would snap at Rico, ignore Elias, avoid eye contact with Marianne. She tried to reach him, but it was like speaking through glass. One night, After a particularly tense family dinner where Malik barely spoke and left the table early, Mary Ann knocked on his door. He didn't answer. She opened it anyway and found him hunched over his sketch pad, headphones on. She sat on the edge of his bed and waited. When he finally looked up, his expression was hard. "You don't get it," he said. "Help me understand." He hesitated, then threw the sketch pad down. "I'm not like them. Not like the other kids at school. Not like the kids in this town. I'm not even like you." She felt a sting, but kept her voice even. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm black, and this world is white, and no matter how much you love me, that's not going to change. I see how they look at me, how they treat me, and it's going to get worse, not better." Mary Ann swallowed the lump in her throat. "You're right," she said. "I can't pretend to know what it's like to be you, but I can listen, and I can stand with you, always." He didn't respond, but he didn't send her away either. That night, she ordered every book she could find on raising black boys in America. She reached out to a black male counselor through the church network and arranged for Malik to start seeing him weekly. At first, Malik resisted, but gradually he opened up and the sharpness in his tone began to dull. Jaden had his own struggles. His intelligence had set him apart at school. Other kids called him weird, robot, or worse. He came home quiet, his shoulders sagging, retreating to his room with his books. Mary Ann noticed his appetite shrinking, his eyes losing their spark. When she asked what was wrong, he always answered with a shrug. Then, one day, she found a notebook under his bed filled with sketches of surgeries, detailed organ systems, and paragraphs about medical procedures, alongside entries titled, "If I Were Normal," and "How to Be Less Strange." Her heart broke reading them. That night, she sat with him in the backyard and told him that brilliance was not something to be ashamed of. That being different was not the same as being alone. They worked together to find him a mentor, a black doctor in a nearby city who agreed to meet with Jaden twice a month. Those visits changed everything. Jaden came back with a light in his eyes and stories to tell. He even started tutoring other kids in science, finding pride in his knowledge instead of shame. The twins' relationship also evolved. As Rico's creativity grew, so did his frustration with rules. He began testing boundaries, skipping homework, sneaking out to hang with older kids, lying about his whereabouts. Ramsey, ever the quieter one, worried constantly and tried to cover for him. Mary Ann caught Rico sneaking in one night past curfew, and the fight that followed was the loudest the house had ever heard. "I'm not a prisoner," he yelled. "Why do you always have to control everything?" "Because I care," she snapped, then immediately regretted the sharpness in her voice. He stormed off, slamming the door. Ramsey later confessed that Rico had been trying to impress some older boys who had laughed at his fashion designs. They called him names, said he was acting, not like a real boy. Mary Ann's heart ached. She sat with Rico the next day, no lectures, just presence. She brought out old photo albums of fashion icons of black designers who had changed the world. Virgil Abloh, Patrick Kelly, Ann Lowe. She let Rico talk. He didn't cry, but his voice cracked when he said, "Sometimes I just want to be seen." "You are," she whispered. "I see you, all of you, and I'm proud of you." Their bond deepened after that. Rico and Ramsey returned to their sketches and fabric, more determined than ever. Mary Ann found a local sewing class for teens and signed them up. They thrived, winning a school design contest and earning local praise. Elias, the youngest, was beginning to ask deeper questions. "Why don't I look like you? Why is my skin darker? Why do people stare at us? Marianne answered with honesty and love. She showed him books with heroes who looked like him, introduced him to stories rooted in African culture, and made sure he saw families that reflected his experience. They attended a Juneteenth celebration that summer, and Elias danced in the street while a local musician let him play the drums. That night, he told her, "I think music is where I belong." Marianne smiled. "Then music will be your home." There were still hard days, nights when someone cried themselves to sleep, mornings when getting out the door took Herculean effort. But the family endured. They were learning each other, constantly and deeply. Marianne no longer felt like an outsider trying to earn trust. She was their mother, and they, her sons. One Sunday afternoon, as they all gathered in the living room, Malik sketching on the floor, Jaden reading aloud from a science magazine, the twins debating fabric textures, and Elias playing a soft tune on his keyboard, Marianne looked around and felt overwhelmed by the life they had built. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was real. It was loud and messy and achingly beautiful. These boys, once strangers, once statistics on a page, had become her purpose. And in the storms they weathered together, she saw not destruction, but growth. They were not broken. They were becoming. By the time the boys were old enough to begin leaving the house for college, apprenticeships, or work, the once crowded home grew quieter in a way that Marianne had not fully prepared herself for. After so many years of shared meals, rushing footsteps, slammed doors, arguments over cereal boxes and who had the front seat, the silence that returned to the house was not the familiar, mournful kind she had lived in before the boys came. It was something deeper, more tender, and laced with pride. It was the silence of accomplishment, of letting go. Malik was the first to leave. At 17, he had received a full scholarship to a university with a nationally recognized architecture program. His application portfolio, pages of careful, imaginative sketches, had earned him not only admission but also personal notes from professors. Marianne drove him to the campus, 4 hours away, in an old van with half a working radio and air conditioning that only functioned when the windows were down. He didn't say much on the drive, just stared out the window, earbuds in, occasionally tapping his sketchbook with a pen. When they arrived, she helped him move into his dorm. Neat, small, already humming with energy, and the scent of too many bodies in too little space. Malik worked quickly, efficiently, arranging his books, pushing his desk against the wall, stacking sketch pads with almost ritualistic focus. When it was time to leave, Marianne stood in the doorway, trying to smile. "You've got this," she said. He looked up, and for the first time in weeks, his face softened. He stepped forward and pulled her into a brief but tight hug. "Thanks, Mom," he whispered. She drove home with tears in her eyes and the windows down, the wind drying her cheeks before the tears had a chance to fall. Jaden left the following year. By then, he had published 2 articles in a youth science journal and had been accepted into a pre-med program at a university that had also offered him a merit-based grant. He had grown into himself, a quiet, methodical young man who wore glasses now and spoke with the precision of someone who thought carefully about every word. On his last night at home, Marianne found him sitting in the backyard, staring up at the stars. "Are you nervous?" she asked, taking the seat beside him. "A little," he admitted, "but I'm ready." He was. Jaden had always been ready. He had always carried a quiet resilience that grew into leadership when no one was looking. Marianne packed his suitcase with care, slipping in a handwritten note he would later frame and place on his dorm desk. The twins stayed longer. Rico and Ramsey, ever inseparable, had launched their own fashion line while still in high school. They sold hand-designed T-shirts at pop-up markets and online, branding themselves as Twin Flame, a nod to both their literal connection and their creative fire. By the time they were 18, they had a local following and an offer to open a small boutique in the city. Mary Ann had never seen them so focused, so united in ambition. She helped them draft business plans, find a commercial space, even paint the walls of their first storefront. The day they opened the boutique, she stood behind them in a crowd of customers, tears silently streaming down her face as she watched the boys she had once tucked into bunk beds now pose with their first cash register receipt. Elias was the last to leave. The baby of the family, the soft-spoken dreamer with music in his bones, had grown into a thoughtful and expressive young man. He had begun writing his own songs at age 10, performing at school events and church gatherings. By the time he was 16, a video of him performing an original song at a talent show had gone viral. A local music school offered him a scholarship, and an independent producer expressed interest in developing his first EP. He hesitated to leave, reluctant to say goodbye to the only home he had ever really known. "You'll always have a home here," Mary Ann told him, hugging him as he packed his keyboard into a case. "Promise?" he asked. "I promise," she said. And then he was gone too. The house was not empty, but it was quiet. Their rooms remained, preserved in the way one might keep a sacred memory. Unmade beds, posters still on the walls, books on shelves, a pair of sneakers under a desk. Mary Ann found herself wandering the halls late at night, standing in doorways, fingers brushing across surfaces that had once been cluttered with life. She didn't cry every day, but sometimes in the silence of early morning or the stillness of dusk, the ache settled in. A kind of ache that came not from loss, but from fulfillment, a fullness that had nowhere left to go. She kept herself busy. The library still needed her. The garden demanded attention. She started volunteering at the community center again, tutoring children and mentoring young mothers. People in town knew her story now. The woman who adopted 5 boys and turned them into kings, someone had called her in an article. She smiled politely when strangers approached her at the market or on walks, grateful for the recognition but wary of the pedestal. She hadn't done it for attention. She had done it because love had asked, and she had answered. Letters came often. Calls, too. Malik wrote about his studio projects, sent photos of buildings he was helping design. Jaden called before every exam and again after, sometimes just to hear her voice. The twins mailed her samples from each new clothing line, always with notes scribbled in loud ink, "For our #1 investor." Elias called her almost daily, sometimes just to play a new chord progression through the phone. She began keeping a box, titled My Boys, full of their letters, photos, recordings, and scraps of fabric from Twin Flame designs. On difficult days, she would open it and sift through the memories like one might sort through seashells, each one a token from a journey that had seemed impossible once. She didn't admit it aloud, but sometimes in her quietest moments, she dreamed of a different house. Not because she was ungrateful for her current one. It held decades of life, of growth, of first steps and last hugs, but because she longed for space to host them all again. A wide kitchen, a bigger dining room, a garden where the grandkids, should they come, could run freely. She would never ask, of course. It was just a thought she carried in her chest like a folded paper. Her own life continued, the edges of her hair silvered. Her joints ached more than before, but her spirit remained steady, the fire in her dimmed only by rest, never by regret. She remained involved in the community, offering wisdom to new foster parents, giving talks at adoption seminars when asked. People listened to her not because she had degrees or credentials, but because she had lived the kind of story that most only dreamed of. One forged in hardship, love, and unrelenting commitment. One spring afternoon, she received a letter in the mail with 5 distinct signatures at the bottom. It was an invitation, formal, printed on heavy cardstock with gold lettering. "Join us for a family gathering in your honor," it read. "Dress comfortably, bring nothing but yourself." There was no return address, only a date and time. When the day came, she wore her favorite blue dress and pearl earrings, the ones she'd saved for special occasions. She rode in a car sent by the boys, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows and a driver in a crisp suit. They drove for nearly 40 minutes through the outskirts of town, past hills and winding roads she hadn't seen in years. And then they turned onto a long gravel path that led to a gated property. The house came into view slowly. It was large, but not ostentatious. White walls, tall windows, a wide wraparound porch with flower beds brimming with her favorite pink roses. The architecture was familiar. Malik's touch was all over it, from the arch of the entryway to the placement of skylights. The car stopped, and as she stepped out, the front door opened. All 5 of them stood there, her sons grown and radiant, each beaming with a pride that needed no words. She stood frozen, hand to her chest. "This," Malik said, stepping forward and pressing a silver key into her palm, "is yours." The others gathered around her, their arms encircling her shoulders, their eyes bright with emotion. "We built it for you," Jaden added, voice trembling, "for everything you gave, for everything you never asked for." She was speechless, overwhelmed. Her knees buckled slightly, but Rico caught her. "Don't cry, Ma," Ramsey whispered, though his own eyes shimmered. "You'll make all of us cry, too." Inside, the house was everything she had once allowed herself to dream of and more. A spacious kitchen with double ovens, a dining table long enough to seat them all, a music room for Elias, a sewing nook for the twins, a reading library for Jaden, a sunlit studio for Malik. Every wall held framed photos of birthdays, graduations, moments caught mid-laughter. In the backyard, a garden bloomed, and beside it stood a white gazebo with vines curling around the posts. There was even a plaque, carefully carved, that read, "For the woman who built this family." Later that night, as they sat around the table, eating her favorite dishes, prepared by them, of course, she looked at each of them and realized that she no longer had to imagine the life she could have had. She had lived it, and it had turned out better than any dream ever could. Her boys were no longer children, but they would always be hers. And the home they had built was not just a gift, it was a promise. That no matter how far they went, no matter how high they climbed, their hearts would always return to her. The weeks following the unveiling of the new house passed in a blur of soft laughter, shared meals, and long, reflective silences. Mary Ann moved in slowly, as though the walls might vanish if she stepped too quickly. Each day she wandered from room to room, fingers trailing along polished banisters, smooth countertops, window ledges that captured the morning light just right. The kitchen became her sanctuary, a wide, open space with sunlight pouring in through bay windows and cupboards stocked with the spices and tools she had always wanted but never allowed herself to ask for. She cooked there often, humming quietly as she did, finding rhythm again in the act of making food not just to eat, but to gather. The boys, now grown and scattered across states and even borders, returned often. They had their own lives, careers that pulled them toward deadlines, performances, boardrooms, and runways. But somehow the house remained a tether. Mary Ann never questioned it. She simply kept the doors unlocked and the beds made. On Sundays, the house filled again. Not with the rough, energetic chaos of their childhood, but with the warm, generous noise of adulthood. Deeper voices, broader shoulders, laughter layered with memory. Jaden always arrived first, slipping into the kitchen to help prepare the table. Rico and Ramsey came next, arguing about something trivial before collapsing in the den with cups of coffee they rarely finished. Malik brought blueprints sometimes, rolled under his arm, half distracted by a project in his head. Elias never failed to bring music, either by softly singing to himself or setting his phone to play whatever song he was working on that week. They told stories. They teased each other, and they never let her lift anything too heavy. Mary Ann kept their childhood photos in the hallway, framed in simple wood. She never replaced them with newer ones. They were there not as replacements, but as reminders. Her boys were men now, yes, but they had once been small, vulnerable, afraid, and she had loved them in every stage. The marks on the doorframe from where she used to measure their height still remained. Malik's at the top, Elias barely past her waist. She never asked for anything. She had lived her life given, not because she felt it was a duty, but because it was simply who she was. And the joy she received, the kind that can only come from watching those you love thrive, was more than enough. But her sons had not forgotten, and they had one more gift to give. One warm evening in early summer, Mary Ann sat on the porch swing, the air fragrant with the scent of blooming roses. The sun had dipped just below the horizon, casting a golden haze across the garden. She was sipping sweet tea, the glass beating with condensation when Malik joined her, folding his long frame into the chair beside her. "You like it here?" he asked. She smiled without looking at him. "I love it." A pause followed, the comfortable kind that only exists between people who share decades of quiet understanding. "We've been talking," he said finally. "All of us." She raised her eyebrows, amused. "That sounds ominous." "It's not," he chuckled. "Well, maybe a little." She turned to look at him fully. "What are you planning now?" Instead of answering, Malik stood and walked back inside. A moment later, all 5 boys came onto the porch, Jaden carrying a thick folder, Rico and Ramsey holding a small wrapped box between them, and Elias trailing behind, humming a tune under his breath. They sat around her, forming a semicircle, suddenly quiet. Elias broke the silence first, sitting on the ground at her feet and resting his head on her knee like he used to when he was small. "We know you never asked for anything," Rico said. "You've given us more than anyone else ever did." Ramsey picked up the thread. "So we wanted to give you something that lasts, not just this house, not just Sundays." Jaden placed the folder in her lap. "It's all official, signed and notarized." She opened it slowly. Inside were a stack of legal documents neatly organized and sealed with ribbons. The top page read, "Mary Ann Hale, Trust Fund. Founders, Malik, Jaden, Rico, Ramsey, Elias." She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "It's a fund," Jaden explained. "For you, for whatever you want. You'll never have to worry about bills, medical expenses, travel, anything." "There's more," Elias added. "We've built in annual contributions, and there's a portion set aside for something else." Mary Ann stared at the papers, overwhelmed. Why would you?" "Because you gave us everything," Malik said, "and we wanted to make sure you'd never need to ask for anything again." "We owe you our lives," Ramsey said. She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You don't owe me. You never owed me." "But we remember," Rico said softly. "Every night you stayed up with us when we were sick. Every time you drove across town to pick us up. Every meeting you sat through when teachers judged us before we spoke. Every birthday cake you baked from scratch, even when you didn't have enough money for candles. Every hug," Elias whispered. "Every I love you when we didn't feel lovable." Marianne couldn't speak. Her hands trembled as she closed the folder and pressed it to her chest. These weren't just papers. They were proof of what love, when given freely, could become. Not repayment, not obligation. Just love returned, multiplied. They helped her to her feet, guiding her back into the house. There, in the kitchen, another surprise waited. A wall that had once been bare now held a mural, a mosaic of tiny tiles forming a tree, its branches filled with glass leaves etched with names and dates. At the base, in gold letters, were the words, "It started with you." She stepped closer, tracing the tiles with her fingertips. Each leaf held a memory, the date of their adoption, the name of a school graduation, a concert, a first sale, a first job offer. It was a living history, a celebration not just of the family they had become, but of the roots she had planted. That night, as they all gathered in the living room, Elias at the piano, Rico draped over the couch sketching, Jaden cross-legged on the rug with a book, Malik and Ramsey quietly discussing their latest project. Marianne sat in her armchair and let the moment wrap around her like a quilt. They had grown. They had scattered. They had built lives of their own. But they had not forgotten. And now, as the years stretched before her, she would never be alone, not truly. Not when her boys had ensured her comfort, her dignity, and her continued purpose. They called her Mama. The neighbors called her the Mother of Kings. But she, sitting in the home built from love and gratitude, called herself something quieter, something simpler, grateful. And that, more than any title, was what mattered most. The summer that followed Marianne's official retirement was filled with more noise and motion than anyone expected, though she had imagined her 60s beginning quietly, with days spent in her garden, afternoons reading on the porch swing, and evenings cooking dinner for one or two. Life had other plans. Her Sundays, once predictable and serene, had grown louder, livelier, and fuller than ever before. The house she once believed would be her final peaceful retreat had become the epicenter of family life, humming with energy that rarely paused. It started with grandkids. Elias had become a father first, twins just like his brothers, two bright-eyed little girls who followed him around with matching musical toys and 1,000 questions a day. The girls called her Mama Rose, a nickname that stuck so quickly even the adults had taken to using it. Jaden followed not long after, with a son who clung to books with the same quiet curiosity his father had once carried. Rico and Ramsey, both married within 6 months of each other, had turned their homes into creative sanctuaries where art and fashion spilled into every room. Malik, though slower to settle into family life, announced one Thanksgiving that he and his partner were expecting, and Marianne had clutched his hand so tightly she nearly cut off his circulation. Her once quiet house was never still anymore. Toys often cluttered the hallway, juice stains found their way into the corners of rugs, and the air rang with the high-pitched voices of children mixing with the deep, familiar laughter of her grown sons. The days moved in a blur of stories, meals, and stolen moments of reflection. Mary Ann no longer sat in silence. Instead, she found herself surrounded by the symphony of the life she had built. The mural in the kitchen grew too. New leaves were added for each grandchild, etched carefully by Elias's own hand. Mary Ann often stood in front of it, tracing the lines as if touching each moment could somehow stretch it, hold it longer in time. Every tile was a memory. Malek's first building ribbon cutting, Rico and Ramsey's Paris runway debut, Jaden's medical humanitarian award, Elias's Grammy nomination. They had all become more than she had ever dreamed, but never too proud to come home. And then, one spring morning, they came with another surprise. It had started, innocently enough, as a conversation about weddings. Elias and his partner had quietly become engaged, and Jaden had announced that his second child would be walking down the aisle as a flower girl, whether invited or not. Mary Ann had laughed until her eyes watered. The teasing continued, mostly from the twins, about the logistics of fitting that many families into one wedding venue. At the time, it felt like a passing conversation, the kind that floats through Sunday chatter and disappears like steam from a pot of soup. But weeks later, it returned. They came over one evening, all five, dressed too nicely for it to be casual. She noticed it the moment they stepped inside, Malek in a suit jacket, Elias in polished shoes, Rico and Ramsey matching in coordinated earth tones, and Jaden holding a small stack of printed cards. She raised an eyebrow as she closed the door behind them. "You boys planning something?" They didn't answer right away. Instead, they gathered around the dining table, placing the cards in front of her. It was a wedding invitation. 5 names, 5 couples, 1 date. "You're getting married?" she asked slowly, reading the elegant lettering. "We're all getting married," Rico grinned. "Together." Mary Ann blinked. "On the same day?" "We've talked about this for a while," Jaden explained. "We figured why not turn the most important day of our lives into something even bigger. Something about family, about unity. And about you," Elias added softly. She looked up, startled. "Me?" "You're the reason we're here," Malek said. "The reason we even know what love is supposed to look like." They called it a celebration of beginnings. 5 weddings woven into one grand ceremony held in the wide gardens of Mary Ann's new home. The planning began immediately, with each son taking on different responsibilities. Rico and Ramsey took charge of aesthetics, naturally, designing everything from the wedding attire to the floral arrangements. Jaden handled logistics, communicating with vendors and organizing schedules. Malek coordinated construction, building an outdoor stage, canopies, and decorative walkways. Elias curated the music, composing an original piece for the ceremony that he planned to perform with a live orchestra. Mary Ann was hesitant at first. She didn't want attention, didn't need grand gestures. But this wasn't about attention. It was about recognition, about gratitude that had matured into legacy. And when the day finally arrived, it became something no one could have imagined. The ceremony was held in late May, under a sky so blue it seemed to echo every shade of joy. Guests traveled from across the country, and even abroad, to witness it. The garden was transformed. Rows of white chairs lined a green lawn, framed by blooming roses and soft lanterns. Music floated in the air, tender and reverent. 5 grooms stood side by side beneath a massive floral archway, each one holding back tears as their brides walked toward them. But the ceremony didn't begin with vows. It began with Mary Ann. Before the officiant ever spoke, the music paused, and Malek stepped forward, turning to the audience. His voice, once unsure in public, now carried power and poise. Before we celebrate the love we found, he said, we want to honor the love that raised us. He gestured toward Mary Ann, seated in the front row in a flowing royal blue gown that Rico and Ramsey had designed just for her. Her silver hair was pinned back, her hands trembling in her lap. When she realized what was happening, her breath caught in her throat. None of this, Malik continued, would exist without the woman who taught 5 broken boys how to become men, how to forgive, how to hope, how to love. He paused, looking at her. She never asked for praise. She never asked for thanks. But today, we give it freely. She is our beginning. She is our home. She is our mother. The crowd stood in unison, applause erupting, thunderous and unstoppable. Cameras flashed, guests wept openly, and for the first time in her life, Mary Ann heard strangers call her a queen. The weddings continued, vows exchanged, kisses shared, dances begun, but for Mary Ann, that moment remained the centerpiece of the day. The photos would later flood social media, spreading across the internet like fire. Headlines followed. 5 brothers marry on same day, honor the woman who raised them. Articles were written. Invitations to speak poured in. A publisher reached out about telling her story in full. Mary Ann declined most of them, preferring her quiet life, but she allowed one interview, conducted in her kitchen over tea, because it would reach other women like her. Women who loved in silence, who gave without expectation, who wondered if anyone noticed, and people noticed. Every Sunday, the house filled again, now not only with her sons, but with their wives, their children, their neighbors and friends. The long table in the dining room overflowed with dishes from every culture and recipe book they had gathered over the years. Laughter echoed off the walls. Toy cars raced under chairs. Juice boxes lay forgotten on side tables. The mural in the kitchen was now impossible to stand before without tearing up. New leaves were added still. Births, anniversaries, milestones. The family tree she never thought she'd have had bloomed far beyond what any of them had imagined. She no longer measured her days in hours but in moments. A grandchild curling up on her lap. Elias's song playing on the radio. Rico's design gracing a magazine cover. Jaden's patience thank you note arriving in the mail. Malik's firm listed on the side of a building downtown. Ramsey's fashion show broadcasted across international screens. Her name was never printed in bold beside theirs, but it was in every corner, every fold, every page of their stories. And as she sat one evening in the garden, surrounded by the voices of those she loved most, watching the sun dip behind the house that they had built not just from bricks and mortar but from memory and gratitude, she smiled to herself. She hadn't received the life she had once prayed for. She had been given something greater. She had not merely adopted 5 boys, she had raised 5 kings. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life tales. Watch the next video to discover another unforgettable journey. And if this touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it.